Okay, welcome along everybody. I'm going to finish off this session by talking a bit more from a practical perspective. Going to be talking about from anticipation to action. So in particular about crafting futures for lasting agency and using some of my doctoral research, which explored organisations of the future and the implications of artificial intelligence on leaders and teams and the adaptation approach as my muse for this process. So I'm originally a social scientist. I graduated in 2022, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we meet on. For me, I'm from Meanjin, or otherwise known as Brisbane, Australia, where we always like to acknowledge the traditional owners of our country and acknowledge that land was never, and their rights to that land were never ceded. So let's get underway. So from anticipation to action. So my clicker isn't working. The whole presentation is not moving. Yeah, perfect. Okay. So as we're all aware as futurists, and it's been a bit of a theme over the last few days at this particular conference, that essentially artificial intelligence is one of the main disruptors at the moment that we're seeing, in particular within organisational contexts. And for me, it's certainly good timing, I guess, for my doctoral research that concluded a bit before ChatGPT was such a common process and became suddenly artificial intelligence is something for us to all be particularly cognizant of. And I'm sure lecturers, teachers, academics and parents of kids all suddenly were realising, now what do we do, that we have publicly accessible options. So for me, from a futurist perspective and looking particularly at the organisational context, that for me, I acknowledge that successful firms during this evolution that's happening at the moment need to not only consider the utilisation of artificial intelligence, but in particular, make sure that they evaluate the where, the why, the what specifically will they actually need to use AI for. And so for me, from my perspective, it's also about making sure that human agency and planetary perspectives, choice and control are central to the value proposition, not just the economic benefits that will come from an efficiency dividend. So for me, it's a very strong ethical lens that I look at futures, and I also look towards the multiple scenarios that could occur from an AI organisational context. So for me at the moment, what drove me to undertake my research was that I was acknowledging that organisations were not all that they weren't really good at enacting change currently. So simple forms of change, even technological change, policy change, process change, were often not managed in a well-formed way. Workforce strategies to do with the organisational design, the operating model of an organisation, were often more reactive in nature. Often there also seemed to be a sense that in many organisations there was a more mature architectural perspective for digitisation, automisation and artificial intelligence, but not that corresponding workforce strategy. So for me, it just seemed like in many target operating models that were being described, much strategy that was being articulated, it was shorter term and it wasn't connected. It wasn't joined up. And so for me, I felt that organisations often had blind spots. Many responses to this acknowledgement of a blind spot led people to think, let's have a futures workshop. So we've probably all been there. I was attending your presentation yesterday where people say, oh, you know, futures thinking, let's sort of apply that as a concept. And for me, I'm a futurist, I'm a consultant, and yeah, bring it. Love that idea. But the workshop typically is usually after the workshop, people sort of say things like, oh gosh, it's so inspiring. I've changed. Oh my, what a brilliant process. We've bonded together. Is this resonating with anyone? We believe anything is possible, and I feel really great and ready to change the world. 2 weeks later, This again is in an organisational setting, but certainly want to acknowledge in community-based settings and co-design settings, you have this sort of plateau. It's a bit like I'm away from home for 5 weeks, and when I get home, it will be a bit of a, oh, I'm back, even though I love my husband very much and very great to be back in a summertime in Brisbane. But 2 weeks later, the typical reaction that I see are these 5 points. So the futurists inspired us, but I'm not really sure what they meant. Some of those terms, some of those frameworks, what is the circle? What does that actually mean again? I remember something about a brain being dissected. The glow of the workshop starts to fade, and then we think, how can we fit this within our business as usual? Did we really commit to that? And how will we get funding for this? I went to the Asia Pacific Futures Network last week and I presented a workshop exactly on this topic, talking about how we actually win grants and win funding and write business cases for futures projects. I'm very happy to sort of share some of those insights with you. The operating environment that we're part of in many organisations, many communities, has this gap between the demand for change and our capacity to be able to respond to it. And so it got me thinking, why do future strategies fail? Anything immediately come to people's heads? Give me one reason why future strategies fail. Yell out. Yep. Yeah. They don't reflect the implementation of the strategy. Certainly one option. For me, it's also that lack of involvement and true co-creation and co-design. So that sense of ownership and the sense of actual good diversity is not there. Did you have a... I only do one workshop. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Another thought? Yeah, the social change. Yeah, yeah, beautiful. Those broader systemic changes. Last point, and then I'll move on. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's the hard sell, isn't it? I remember from your presentation yesterday, scenarios are often never converted into an actionable and funded roadmap. Systems and incentives, especially for leaders, are often geared to today's performance and not the wider issues. Low acknowledgement of the deeper layered personal shifts that are required. In my doctoral research, I explored the impact of mindset using Dweck's fixed and growth mindset on people's ability to anticipate the future. And it was quite startling. It's all published research out there. Ineffective governance and management of delivering the future. Lack of early reevaluation or adjustment post those first few steps, and considering what's happening in the broader context shifts, fixed mindsets, and the lack of applied lessons learned. Sound familiar? So for me, as part of the process, I wanted to realise that for workshops, especially when we're thinking about anticipating the future, that workshop processes usually only go part way. This is actually just a typical change curve. Normally, it's a bit more messier in the centre. So a futures workshop typically would go from, you know, I'm at the workshop, I'm hearing what they're saying, I'm starting to understand it, I'm playing with some case studies, I'm starting to support it, but then that bit in the red coloured box, act, use, own the future state, often doesn't happen. If we don't have reinforcement, like what you mentioned, it's very unlikely that will happen, and we'll end up with a scenario like this cartoon. So hopefully you can see that okay. So to action the future, we need 4 primary components that have a strong connection. In my experience as a futurist, a change and transformation specialist needs 4 components. First of all, the future ideally needs to have a degree of desirability associated with it. And what that means, the desirability, it might not necessarily be beautiful or an attractive future, but it basically needs to be a point where people need to believe and trust, pretty critical, that the future state offers more than the current state. The second part of the process is achievability. People need to understand the pathways to the future state, knowing that they could be multiple pathways, and be actually enabled to achieve this future state. The third point from an organisational perspective is this notion of viability. So people need to believe that the reasons behind the change towards the future are valid and that the rewards outweigh the costs. And the final component relates to notions around assurance or evaluation or audit and validation. So there needs to be a commitment to the evaluation of progress and effective delivery, governance and accountability. Next week, I think, is the UN the Summit of the Future, isn't it? And so if we're thinking about those sustainability development goals that have been around for a while, and you're looking at these four, you think, what happened? What happened to make some of those goals not necessarily be met? And it's probably a little bit of all of those. Thank you. So from my perspective, as futurists, we can't work in silos. We've got to work and collaborate across disciplines and domains. And we've heard a lot over the last few days of the notions of designers and designing the future. But then we need also those who can adapt and help organisations, help communities, help individuals adapt to the futures that are coming. We also, though, need our good delivery crews, delivery teams, our people who actually can plan, can actually manage a project, can actually manage a program of transformation, and make sure that we also don't just have the futurists at one workshop and then never see them again, but to actually build a relationship or an embedded practice, which is why I keep on pointing at you, that it's about making sure that we can collaborate across boundaries. And with these four interests, plus others, and a commitment to co-design, we'll definitely have a little bit more confidence that at least we're heading in our direction that hopefully will be a little bit more effective. But I take the point that I'm talking more organisationally. Societal change still requires this collaboration, but certainly there are other players in a broader community and systemic change process. From my research, I identified a number of different operating models of the future in organisational contexts that range from parts of organisations being fully machine-centred, maybe even machine-led, where your boss in the future or your leader in the future might actually be an AI algorithm directing your work, to the opposite end of the continuum, which is human-centred. So consider this a bit more like the artisan. Consider this the VIP service, that in the future, who do you want to actually clean your house? If you were blessed to have that amount of money, do you want a robot to clean your house, or would you like a person to clean your house? For me, my mum is in her early 80s, Dorothy. She always knows that I mention her. If my mum was put within an aged care service, who would I like to bring her pills if she needed medication? Would I like a robotic concierge to arrive and just spit out the pills in a paper cup, or would I like a warm hand? What we'll be seeing in organisational futures in the next sort of medium term is that middle, a collaborative approach, a hybrid approach, where there is a human and AI ratio that organisations need to articulate. Because we have to acknowledge within that context, as part of enacting organisational futures, that it's more than a technical install, because we're actually creating significant shifts if we're replacing and automating human typical roles, which is a valid business case. We need to be also cognizant that we're actually changing and creating organisational ecosystems that are new, as well as totally new industries and the ways that we work together. Implementation for me is a cultural and systemic change, and the model that you can see up there came from a co-design process in my research, which looked again at making sure that our adaptation approach is reflective of the organisation's ecology, but also is cognizant of the environment that we're part of. be that whether we're part of a multi-layered governance approach in a global organisation, be it more socio-political, socio-cultural, geographic distributions, or other notions of national sovereignty that will mean AI might be imposed, and that's the decision made by the government, or whether it's actually shared, designed to appropriate ethical standards. So there are many different ways of delivering the future. There's the linear approach, there's the more agile or incremental approach, which is more common. And certainly there are tools such as the backcasting method as one way to start to think about what were those core memories. If we go to the future state we're looking to, what happened to actually preempt that? And then you go back further. It's part of the 6 pillars approach. But to get to that future, we also need to take it more than just a scenario, more than just a story, more than just a single view. It needs to, if we want to operationalize the future, we want to head towards the future, we need to consider what would be the target operating model of the future. What's the wraparound supports for that future that are necessary to make it possible? Could be changes to legislation, changes to policy, changes to the culture of the organisation, technology. Maybe we need different infrastructure. Maybe we need different data and information. What falls within the gap from the current state to the future is where the jobs come from. The list of activities, the list of processes, and certainly if we're looking then to fund those future projects, the value case or business case. So in my wrap-up process, putting it all together, from my research, we need to amplify the voice of the impacted and harder to reach participant or customer or user or client, whatever we'd like to call them. Learn from the past and co-create pathways to the future. Work across those domains that I mentioned and broaden the circle. Remain curious. If things aren't working, be willing to unlearn and try another way. Try to influence those decision makers who require evidence, but they also require involvement and they require a clear understanding of what happens if we don't change. And finally, look after yourself, because doing futures work is hard. It can be upsetting. It can actually be something that makes us feel a bit jaded or a bit grief-stricken. So make sure that you look after yourself. And that's what I find these conferences are a way of community building. And please keep connected. Thanks, everyone. How long have I got for questions? Well, that was good timing. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. This was really interesting, and you did go into the human being in a sense. I'm wondering, how do you perceive fear in this whole thing of change? Because that's what I've noticed a lot of times. Have you dealt with that a bit?
Yeah, certainly the fear is real. And I've done recent work in a water utility organisation in Australia. And when we're talking about longer term future horizons, especially from a sustainability perspective, there's a lot of unknowns in that process. For me, what I find from a fear-based perspective is to sit with people, create an environment that is a safe environment for people to ideally express what those fears are, even if it is through the power of the pen and not a verbal opportunity to share, I'm feeling scared about this, because not everyone is really comfortable with verbally expressing it, but they might be able to write it down, or they might be able to draw an image of the future that might be relevant. And then for me, I find, depending on the severity, let's call it, of the fear, that for some people it may actually need a form of therapeutic support or healing support. For others, it might just be a buddy and a listen and a coach, and the acknowledgement of the tools that they have and the fact that they've probably in their life overcome many challenges before, but when the heat is there, it's just a reminder of what their adaptive capacity is too. is what I approach. As a social scientist, I started my career off in domestic and family violence prevention. So that's how I approach it. There's another question.
I'm all ready. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I feel like I've got like about 20 different questions, which I would love to talk to you about at lunch or something. Maybe kind of like two, and you can pick which one feels better for now. I just kind of like riffing off of the fear thing. One of the themes that seems to have come up a number of times in this conference for me is around grief and loss. And that seemed to be a big theme when you were, I mean, you kind of mentioned it just in that kind of pulling it all together, that kind of look after yourself. And you were referencing kind of in that kind of action towards future needs ownership and the desirability, the viability, the achievability, assurance, validation. I'm just kind of curious about how kind of like needing people to buy in, but how do you manage that sense of, in order to move to a new future state, you need to let go of the past or the present, some element of the past or the present. So I was kind of curious about how there's any kind of like grief or loss, or how you kind of manage that in the process. And the other kind of question, which I don't know if it's linked to this, but to me, it seems in the context of workforce and AI, that there's an element to what we were talking about at the end of my session yesterday around power dynamics. One has an assumption that when you're thinking about a workforce reshift, I'm assuming that the most senior leaders are probably going to keep their jobs and aren't going to be replaced by AI. And it's the more junior ones that with less power that will. So I was kind of curious about that. I don't know if they're kind of linked at all, but anyway, that's just kind of like two questions.
Yeah, thank you. So the first time I shared this model was at a conference in Dubai, not the not the big futures conference, but a conference connected to project managers. And I mentioned the machine-centered and said machine-led. And within the room, there was this palpable sort of shuffling in the seats of people going, "Oh, like, you mean who will do my performance development plan, and who will provide me instructions?" And so for me, from a leadership perspective, power will be shifting. And I am a strong advocate for a human in the loop, and I'm also a very strong advocate of making sure that organisations and leaders in particular have an ethical guardrails, set of principles, set of criteria in this sort of regulation void at the moment, so that they can actually include new forms of criteria as part of their decision-making process. In the future, if we're changing our operating model and incorporating AI, we won't need as many leaders. We'll need more people that might be relation builders, joiners, futurists, change managers, change agents, and leadership roles will shift and change. To deal with the fear of that, given that leadership is often connected to strong senses of passion and purpose, and also ego to some people. It's about the acknowledgement of maybe the legacy that they can leave behind. And what I've also found is effective, depending on the age of the particular leader, is the opportunity to be part of the transformation effort and actually to then support the next generation of leaders to come through the process. So give them a part to play. But at the end of the day, it's about listening, and it's about being fully present with the person, because it may be the first time that they've actually ever felt vulnerable in a professional role, and to make sure that they're properly supported in the process. Yeah, I also sometimes ask in my presentations, who's got a smartwatch? Who's got a smartwatch on their wrist? Yeah, a few people. So I'm sort of thinking, in a way, you're already getting led a little bit if it tells you when to stand up and have a drink of water and move or wake up. So we're already starting to be desensitized a little bit now. So if you feel safe to do so, be free from that sometimes and keep your ability to make meaning. I think we're out of time, but yeah, so can we catch up at lunch? But I'd like to say thank you to all the speakers. It's been a really great session. I'd love a photo with the speakers if we can sort of have you guys down after, but I think we've got a morning tea break now, don't we? Yeah, and also someone, one of my buddies mentioned that they didn't realise there's a dinner on tonight. You might have missed that, but there is a dinner somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where it is.